Hello. After having talked about old comedy in our previous lecture, today we shall talk about the second phase of Greek comedy, which has come to be known as Middle Comedy. In the crucible of classical age, Greece was cast into a new and different world, albeit not a wiser or more livable one. Greece did not polarize around Sparta and Athens any longer. The Greeks' cultural and commercial affairs, however, were a very different matter. These thrived internationally, and Greek influence began to spread all around the Mediterranean. Classical texts, the dramas especially, played astonishingly well abroad. In the wake of Alexander's conquests rose his successor generals, the so-called diadochoi, who were in reality little more than a succession of petty tyrants. Their despotism proved a death blow to the independent polis, the civic monument which had in many ways defined the classical age. Its demise was a tragedy even more devastating than the dissolution of Athenian democracy. Being an Athenian or a Spartan or even a Theban began to matter less and less. The whole ancient world, including Greece, was turning into a cosmopolis of sorts, engaged in trade and industry, and reciprocal conquest and domination. The global situation had come to resemble a rat race, in which a succession of increasingly vicious, immoral, and greedy rodents entered and exited the scene so fast that no one could foresee where all this was heading. Amidst all this upheaval and the inevitable vicissitudes of life in a post-modern world, survival itself became a very difficult endeavor, entailing saving one's own job and family from the potentially crushing chaos of treacherous fortune. So friends, traditions, language, and literature, which were the very heart of Greek culture, lost their glory. Everything that mattered about being a proud Athenian seemed diminished in this ever-expanding world. The worst thing about all this was the readiness of foreigners to absorb Greek culture. The barbarians started learning the Greek language. When they ventured to speak that most fundamental tool of Greek culture, the honeyed gift that had once lilted over the lips of Homer, Sappho, and Aeschylus was shaped in their guttural gullets. Their mouths were ill-tuned to the delicate rhythms and intricacies of a language down which epic, lyric, and tragedy had flowed once. In a barbarian's mouth, to be frank, the language was no longer Greek, but a bastardized, international knockoff of the real thing. Or, as the Greeks say, koine, meaning common, and applied to speech, it meant common speech. A more honest translation would be vulgar. To make matters worse, as the Greek world began moving to the beat of changing times, the Olympian religion itself started to falter. New deities started to flood the marketplace. Isis, for example, was imported from Egypt by sailors whose fortunes she was set to govern. From the east, Mesopotamian astrology appealed to those who sought their destiny in the stars or planets or anything but earth and their own choices and actions. Others parted company with heaven and sought solace in logic-based philosophies. Do-it-yourself cosmologies became popular that taught how best to deal with life's mundane miseries. For instance, Stoicism preached an unemotional attitude to life. If I don't care about it, it can't hurt me, was its answer to the tribulations of existence. Epicureans, on the other hand, advocated withdrawal from the anxieties of life. In such a cultural climate, dramas delivering serious messages about local political issues, like the comedies of Aristophanes or Eupolis, were incompatible with modern living, as were tragedies set in a remote and by now clearly fictitious vision of some heroic Homeric past. Tragedy, as a result, declined precipitously. For many reasons, it was basically the failure of heirs of Euripides and Sophocles. Tragic drama staggered, collapsed, and molded as a mainstream art form, evolving eventually into an antiquarian exercise of escape which some pursued. However, from the other side of the stage, against all odds, comedy survived this crisis, but only by reinventing itself dramatically. It was no longer able to depend on the polis for its vitality because the undoing of the independent city-state was hardly anything to joke about. Eventually, Greek comic drama turned into new comedy, basing its humor on the tumultuous lives of ordinary people, though usually its targets were considerably richer rather than ordinary people. Still, in spite of a frightfully protean world, an age when so many other arts were in turmoil and more than one fell into obsolescence and obscurity, comedy forged on and even thrived. It was a tribute to the genius of post-classical comic poets. My dear students, the radical changes in social and political conditions which rained down on Greece in the 300 BC led to equally elemental changes in theatre. As tragedy slowly faded from public attention, revivals of old tragedies, that is, classical 5th century plays by Euripides and Sophocles primarily, began to play a more central role in Greek theatre. This left a gap in the entertainment niche, which in turn opened the possibility of a new genre to rise. Mime was one contender for the public attention in that open niche, though it did not achieve supremacy, at least not at first. Its bawdy, lowbrow nature, no doubt, appeared simplistic to audience nursed on the vigorous intellectualism of the arts in the classical age. At the same time, the precocious heckling of old comedy fared little better. As long as it had rested in the hands of masters like Aristophanes or Eupolis and played before a restless, idealistic democracy, it had found a way to address complex and compelling issues. But that was no longer the case. As tyranny supplanted freedom, as pragmatism displaced the search for answers to the big questions in life, as greed won over patriotism, the playwrights of comedy had to adapt their art to the world around them. Besides, the humor-generating formula of the great idea must not have seemed particularly funny to a society which really needed one. What theatre was starving for was something novel and original, but the recipe for survival was not immediately forthcoming. There was still much middle ground to cross. Social and political issues had to settle into some sort of scheme before drama could reflect the new order. An otherwise unknown historian named Platonius preserves one explanation for the social causes underlying the changes in post-classical drama. He opines that as power fell from the people's hands into the hands of few individuals, the poets became afraid. It was not possible to ridicule anybody openly because those who were ridiculed would sue poets in court. As a result of this, they became more hesitant to ridicule. The Athenians were no longer eager to appoint producers who would pay the expenses for choruses. For example, Aristophanes brought out Eulosicon, which does not have choruses. Since there were no producers appointed or meals provided for the chorus, comedy was gradually deprived of its chorus songs, and the type of subjects it dealt with was changed. In old comedy, the object of ridicule were the demagogues, jurors, and generals. But Aristophanes gave up his customary ridicule out of great fear and criticized Aeolus, the drama by the tragedians, as being bad. Eulosicon of Aristophanes is just like middle comedy, and so is Odysseus by Cratinus, and many older comedies which do not have choruses and parabasis. Sadly, there is little way for us to gauge the validity of these conclusions or measure the evolution of what is called middle comedy without a single complete Greek tragedy or comedy surviving between that of last of Aristophanes in 388 BC and first of Menanders in 316 BC. Since a lack of data makes it impossible at this remove to track how Greek drama developed over the course of the 4th century BC, historians are left with no other option than to skip ahead to its outcome and try as best as they can to suppose what must have happened in between. Both political and intellectual history of this age hints at some of the processes directing this evolution. it is commonly supposed that new comedy, the ultimate product that emerged from the evolution of comic drama during the early post-classical period, arose somehow out of the many types of philosophies which cropped up around this time, especially ethical studies such as those espoused by Theophrastus from 370 to 286 BC. His work, The Characters, centers on the description of personality types, mostly unpleasant ones. We shall discuss two examples here. First, the Garrulous Man. He says that garrulity is the delivery of words which are irrelevant, long, and not thought out ahead of time. The garrulous man is the sort of person who will sit down next to someone he doesn't know and start talking first about his wife, how wonderful she is, and then narrate in full the dream he had last night, and then tell what he had for dinner course by course. Now that he is warmed up, he'll say that we are not the men we used to be in the good old days, and the whole city is full of foreigners, and it is a good thing we can go to sea now that it's late March, and we could sure use some more rain from Zeus Almighty, and so on. Very garrulous indeed. Next is the disgusting man. He says that disgustingness is openly and shamefully ridiculous behavior. The disgusting man is the sort of person who flashes in front of married women and in the theater applauds when everyone else is silent and boos the actors everybody else loves. And when the theater is silent, he lifts his head up and belches so everyone turns around and looks at him. He calls by name people he doesn't know, and if anyone is in a hurry, he tells them to slow down and wait for him, and so on. Again, very disgusting indeed. Friends, from the comical nature of these analyses of character, it is often assumed that the brand of philosophy perpetrated by Theophrastus stimulated the character-driven drama that peoples most new comedies. Certainly, grumpy old men, lovesick youths, crafty slaves and their ilk, who are the typical denizens of later Greek comedy, especially that of Menanders, are part and parcel of psychological way of reflecting on human life by Theophrastus. Of course, the chronology of all this is fuzzy, as is so often the case in ancient studies, and therefore the reverse is also possible. In other words, dramatic comedy may have fostered philosophy of character of Theophrastus, as we simply do not know which preceded which. If anything, the dating argues for theatre's primacy, since several comic character types, particularly the braggart, the coward, the managing slave, and so on, are visible in theatre as early as the 5th century, well before the time of Theophrastus. Moreover, the sense of unchanging personality type is a natural extension of classical theatre, where masks freeze a dramatic character in one expression and thus one emotional mode. As a result, angry old men will always look old and angry on stage when masks depict them that way. This then leaves open the question of where and how personality-centered comedy arose. The truth is that it goes back as far as can be seen in Greek literature. Homer includes typical comic characters such as the abusive misanthrope Parasites and the scheming wife Hera. For us, however, the issue revolves not around ultimate origin of these characters, but when they first entered the stage and who was responsible for giving them a dominant role in theatre. While Aristophanes and his contemporaries almost certainly recognized and played on stereotypical characters, old comedy did not rely upon them as a driving force. Ideas, not characters, ruled comedy in the classical age. The change from idea-driven to character-driven comic drama must have transpired at some point during the long and murky medieval age, now known as Middle Comedy, which spans most of the 4th century BC. It would be helpful then to review plays from this period, but no complete play survives. We are left in the dark because there are only titles and fragments left. To judge from what pitiful shards exist, it is clear no single type of comedy defined this age. In some ways, the evidence suggests Middle Comedy looked back to its forebears in the classical age. For instance, current politicians and well-known figures were pilloried, just like in Old Comedy, but probably not as directly, centrally, or vigorously as Aristophanes and Cratinus had done. However, if any type of drama predominated in Middle Comedy, it was the mockery of classical myth and tragedy, particularly of Euripides, which was another sort of backwards glance. But in spoofing Euripides, Middle Comedy playwrights were in fact not just ridiculing him, but also reappropriating his plots, characters, and dramatic dynamics for their own purpose. Indeed, influence of Euripides on later Greek comedy is arguably the greatest of all 5th century dramatists, even more than that of Aristophanes. Other notable trends in Middle Comedy are more forward-looking. For instance, in the last 2 extant plays of Aristophanes, the role of the chorus is severely diminished, in line with a general pattern of evolution across the century. By Menander's day, in fact, the chorus had declined so far that choral odes were completely disconnected from the main play, which means that at some point during the evolution of Middle Comedy, these must have fallen entirely out of the playwright's purview, who stopped composing songs altogether. Choristers instead sang embolima, the inserted songs not composed for a particular drama but imported into it from other sources. When later the custom arose of inserting these at 4 intervals in the play, a tradition was born that plays should consist of 5 discrete acts. Thus was established the 5-act rule, seen not only in Greek New Comedy but also in later Roman tragedy and even in French classical drama in the modern age. This signals to some the demise of the chorus as an integral feature of drama. However, it is wise not to assume too much here. If Aristotle appears to deprecate the embolema, it does not mean they had no dramatic value whatsoever or no affiliation with the play being presented on stage. The embolema could always have had a thematic or analogical tie to the main storyline of the drama. Moreover, the fact that music and dance maintained their presence on the post-classical Greek stage even after being dissociated from the play itself argues strongly that the Greek audience still wished to see these elements in the theatre. Perhaps it was an advantage to post-classical Greek dramatists that they no longer needed to be musicians and lyricists as well as poets and dialogue makers. That surely opened up playwriting as a career to a wider range of talent. The long and short of it is that the evolution of middle comedy makes it clear that the Greeks were well on their way to inventing the variety hour. Along with connected choruses went out the parabasis too, which was the old comedy playwright's opportunity to address his audience directly and comment on current events and modern life. In tune with the changing times, satirical elements were in general downplayed, as were the crudities and raw humor so prevalent in the days of Aristophanes. And so, among other casualties, the phallus sang its death song. Instead, the prominence of the phallus was now handed over to a melange of characters based on dramatic stereotypes. The lovesick young man, the clever slave, the greedy prostitute, the braggart soldier, the miserly old man, the talkative cook, the scheming pimp, and all the rest. How, when, and by whom these types were introduced into the comic stage is a question that cannot be answered satisfactorily, given the evidence at hand. But even though fragmentary, the data leave behind enticing hints. Alexis of Thurii was the greatest exponent of comic drama during the Middle Comedy, and evidence suggests that he was instrumental in this transition. While no complete play of his survives, 140 titles and over 300 fragments of his comedies attest to both his popularity and longevity as an artist. The evidence hints at his use of intrigue and deception in his plays, both of which are well-known features of New Comedy. He was probably involved in their integration into drama one way or another. Thus, though a pivotal figure in the history of theatre, the image of Alexis is little more than a tantalizing silhouette hanging between the portraits of Aristophanes and Menander. It has been surmised, for instance, that his play Parasite contained the prototype of what would become one of the most popular characters in New Comedy, that is, the Parasite. In origin, a priest's helper who sat beside him at meals and assisted in the administration of a sacred banquet, the Parasite turned under guidance of Alexis into a hanger-on, the companion of rich people who feed him in return for amusement and flattery. Thus, if not the founder of New Comedy itself, Alexis appears to have crafted one of the most prominent and successful characters in its portfolio. It is all the more tragic that none of his plays survive. Even if the history of Alexis is lost in shadows, it is evident that his shadow was a long one. Finally, and perhaps the most important thing to note about this period of theatre history is that most middle comedy playwrights were not native-born Athenians. The cosmopolitan life of post-classical Greece was clearly making an impact on Greek society by now, and the arts naturally followed in tow. That is, as the 4th century BC came to a close, the back door of the theatre of Dionysus had admitted a pool of talent imported from far beyond the immediate vicinity of Attica. Thank you.